I'm Jen Stone, a partner at Robert A. Stern Architects, and I'm excited to be a part of this first segment and to introduce our new series called Conversations at RAMSA. This forum will bring our clients, colleagues, and friends together for a variety of short, casual, and smart conversations on timely topics. Today's episode is about the decisions higher education leaders must be making now, given the current state of this pandemic, while considering what this means for institutions in the long term. I'm so delighted to be joined today with two special guests. First is Rick Staisloff, founder and principal at RPK Group, who has been a decades-long friend and colleague, as well as Scott Carlson, who I'm sure you all know is a senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education. So I want to welcome both of you to this conversation, and thank you for being our first guests. Rick and Scott live and breathe higher education just like I do and work with several institutions across the country. So I want to start this discussion by asking the question, what issues are institutions facing right now and how are they dealing with them?
It's a great start, Jen, and thanks for the opportunity to join in with you and to kick off this series. It just seems so timely and focused. So what are institutions thinking about right now? You know, I've been thinking about what the big questions are on the table, and one of the big things that hits me, and I can't wait to hear what the two of you say, is the questions on the table right now in many ways are the same questions that have been on the table, right? If we think about, we knew an enrollment cliff was coming, and now here we are with serious enrollment issues going into the fall. We knew the valve was getting turned on international students and all they represent financially and otherwise, and international students probably aren't coming back for a while. Public funding sources had been really in an anemic recovery coming out of 2008, and now they're once again in decline. We were seeing more and more shifts to remote learning and remote work. So it's the same questions. So what's changed? I think it's really the urgency that those questions just can't be ignored anymore by higher ed, and they are going to have to respond in smart ways.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing. I mean, Rick brings up a good point in the sense that it's been sort of this pattern over a series of decades, even, that, you know, colleges have had this increasing pressure. And so the last major crisis was, you know, the 2008 recession, and that led a lot of colleges and parents and students really to sort of question, you know, what are we getting out of this process here? And of course, that had been a background question for a number of years, and a question that had come with increasing urgency. But then after 2008, you started to see, hey, kids coming out of some really great schools in terms of the name and still not being able to get a job. And so that started to raise in the public consciousness this big question around, what's college for? What are you supposed to get out of it? Is return on investment really sort of the goal of this? Is a job the goal of this, or is it something deeper and bigger? And I think those kinds of questions are going to become more intense through the COVID crisis and after.
But boy, you know, I was going back looking at some of the numbers, you know, coming out of what was the last time higher ed got crushed. Higher ed went and spent more and more money every year after 2008 on every student, right? Like all the lines on spending, certainly, if you look at it that way, went up. So we didn't change what we were doing and the way we were doing it at a moment when I would have thought we would have wanted to or had to. It certainly feels once again like can't run now. Got to make the hard choices around program offerings, around how learning in a quality way happens, around how do we bring students together in different ways. So the rational part of my brain says, yeah, that's going to happen. But I don't want my heart to be broken, you know, in terms of what is or isn't going to happen.
I just think the existential crisis for so many of these colleges, particularly the small liberal arts colleges, is so dire that, and it's been dire for a while now, but it's now reaching a breaking point. And I think, you know, for those schools, the ones that are able to survive this, we'll see, they're really going to have to ask the tough questions about what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I think, you know, for the bigger institutions, for the ones with, you know, resources, I don't know if this is true, you know, Rick, I would ask you questions about this, but do you think that the the institutions with more resources, do you think that they generally have administrations that maybe are coming from a place where they come out of business more, they come out of different environments more, and so they're more willing to question the kinds of operations that colleges have had so far? What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's some truth to that because the risk is less. If you don't get it wrong, if you've got other resources, then you can kind of fail forward a little bit. So, you think about some big plays with like, I don't know, Purdue and Kaplan, right? I mean, that was a bold move to just launch them into globally the online world. Well, there were a very small handful of institutions in the country that could have done something like that. Let's take it down a notch though. Do we think that at better resource institutions, they might have a better opportunity, or they've had longer to think about this and put some other solutions in play? Yeah, I was really struck interviewing like Arizona State University. Boy, they had this incredibly robust response in play to deal with COVID that came out of the H1N1 virus, decades ago, right? And they put all this infrastructure in place. So they were kind of ready. Doesn't mean they didn't have challenges. So what's certainly clear is we're seeing once again the have-nots play out, right? And so your ability to adjust price, your ability to spend more to bring students back in a safe way is very different, right, for different kinds of institutions. And your good point that will we reach a point where for some institutions you just can't write the check anymore, literally? Yeah, that could well be coming.
Yeah, the financial damage of this pandemic is still yet to be understood. And the difference between now from 2008, as you both stated, I think the difference is the urgency and to be making these brave business decisions, as well as tying them to the health and wellness and safety of our students. I agree, institutions must be better prepared for the long term. And this time it might be in order to survive. So coming to this conversation as an architect, I've also seen campus design evolve a lot since 2008, and I've seen more and more focus on experiential and interdisciplinary learning. And unlike the Arizona State University model that Rick mentioned, other institutions have been focused on creating spaces for social experience and human connections, and they've made great strides, huge strides to improve and measure student success. So COVID just turned building spaces that support this community upside down. So with all of our different perspectives and combined lived experiences on college campuses, and knowing institutions need to reevaluate and optimize where the money goes, what does this mean for the future of campus planning and design standards and utilization? And how do these decisions continue to emphasize and enhance student success?
Well, I mean, space utilization has been one of the big things that they've talked about on campus for a long time. I mean, here we are with these really compelling third spaces in society. It's a college campus is, even if it's a private college campus, is still a space that's very much open to the public. You can walk on the campus. It's park-like in a way. And the buildings themselves, are often places that, have a majestic value to them in terms of the architecture that's there, and also have sort of an openness to them in terms of allowing, people from the community or people from the outside the campus walls to sort of pass through it and use the spaces. But to better utilize those spaces is really going to be the challenge. I mean, we're talking about, campuses that are open 9 months out of the year. And even when they are open, most of the activity is concentrated in the middle 3 days of the week and during the middle 3 hours of those days. So spreading that activity out is really important. And it's not just about the classrooms. I mean, if you look at a large campus, everyone talks about, hey, there's all these classrooms on campus. Why aren't we holding classes more often, longer periods during the day? Well, classrooms are only 5% of the space on a pretty large campus like Penn State. offices, faculty offices, admin offices, that's a third of the space on campus often. So, and we know that, especially for faculty, a lot of those spaces are empty part of the time. So what do we do with that? Like, how do we make these spaces more active and better utilized in terms of what goes on in them?
Again, it seems to speak to me to how do we get more for what we already have, right? Whether it's people, time, space, money, in order to create something that's more robust, that's more nimble, that's more able to respond to the unknowns that get thrown at us.
Well, and also, getting out of, in terms of the space, getting out of these sort of historical grooves that we're in, right? As I've heard you talk about, college wants to put up a building and they're thinking, where do we put the lecture hall for 500 kids? And is that the right thing that we ought to be doing in this current day and age, right?
Yeah, it gets back to that return on investment idea. Yeah, if it's the better part of $1 million to build that lecture hall, and if I can create a robust experience online, do I really need to make that investment anymore? And where would I put that space now? And where would I put that money? That's going to have a bigger result.
Your points about large lecture halls are spot on. And Rick, I think you and I have joked about it. These large lecture halls should be in a museum called What Not to Do. We've been challenging our clients for years on the value of these rooms and actually have been quite successful convincing them to trade in these expensive spaces for more flexible and useful space. So now that COVID's here, it's probably likely that these large lecture hall formats the question will go to bed. And from a design and environmental perspective, I think there are other positive things that might be coming out of this crisis, like the focus on indoor air quality and improved hygiene and just a general respect for health and wellness. There's also there will be and has been a focus on adaptive reuse. And as you both stated earlier, perhaps these underutilized spaces and office spaces that consume so much of our campus space, they should be reconsidered and repurposed. So like the large lecture hall, what other spaces are at risk and what should be really reconsidered?
In terms of the spaces, I'm not so sure. I mean, I've written in the past about, what's the future of library spaces? What's the future of public spaces on campus or of monuments, those kinds of things. I think sort of the big change, and this is related to space, but it's also related to pedagogy, is, how are we utilizing time on campus? It's the space-time continuum on campus, right? There's a lot of people who are now talking about, seat time at colleges, and is that really a proper way to measure, how a student is learning? But I think about it in terms of, the relationship between time and space on campus. So seat time is part of that. Do we have to have a place where a student sits for 8 hours during this class, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or whatever it is? Or can we break up that time in some other way? They still get what they need, but they're not necessarily sitting in a space on campus. How do we think about, as I was just talking about earlier, time on campus in terms of the academic calendar, in terms of the year? I mean, I think these are kinds of things that, especially with COVID, and with some colleges like Ithaca College, for example, this year saying, which I think is kind of a crazy idea, but they're saying, hey, look, we're not going to start our academic year until October because we're going to sort of wait out some of these things having to do with COVID, and then there's other colleges that are saying, hey, we're starting in August. And then there's other colleges that are saying, hey, we're not going to start until January. Thinking about time in a different way, which had been a rut before, might be a new way of kind of approaching college and college learning and the space.
I think all of you are pointing to, we've got to connect the learning and how learning happens into the space dialogue. And so you're right. If we were to move more deeply towards block scheduling, for instance, why do we have all 4 classes happening at the same time instead of go deep on 2, then do 2, break it up? If we think about competency-based models, which you were starting to get on the table, where it's not really about the time, it's about demonstrated competencies and how you show them through good assessment, that really starts to disrupt the learning, and it unbundles the faculty role, and that could have a direct relationship to where and how learning happens.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the competency question, too, then you start to think about the spaces off campus.
Yeah.
Then the educators start to think, okay, well, if it's about competency, then why are they sitting in this course? Why aren't they taking part of their course at the local business or at the local national park or at, you know, the local architecture firm, you name it. I mean, there are other ways of occupying an educational space that doesn't necessarily have to be a campus space.
Yeah, excellent points. And I'll emphasize the positive movement towards blurring the line between on and off campus learning and building those human connections and networks through experiential learning, and also creating interactions with local communities. It's a win-win, and as you both pointed out, it really reinforces the value of higher education and that return on the individual's investment. So Rick and Scott, I've seen you on many stages, and I know we could talk for hours, but I promise to keep this segment short. So in closing, I'd just like to say that while higher education leaders are really having to determine a path forward now, they must be so grateful to have you giving advice and having your perspective. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. So thanks again.
Great. Thanks, Jen. We're looking forward to keeping the dialogue going.
Thank you
so
both.
much. Thank you.